Weaving is a method of textile production in which two distinct sets of yarns or threads are interlaced at right angles to form a fabric or cloth. Similar methods are knitting, felting, and braiding or plaiting. The longitudinal threads are called the warp and the lateral threads are the weft or filling. The method in which these threads are interwoven affects the characteristics of the cloth. Cloth is usually woven on a loom, a device that holds the warp threads in place while filling threads are woven through them. A fabric band which meets this definition of cloth can also be made using other methods, including tablet weaving, backstrap, or other techniques without looms. The way the warp and filling threads interlace with each other is called the weave. The majority of woven products are created with one of three basic weaves: plain weave, satin weave, or twill. Woven cloth can be plain, or can be woven in decorative or artistic design. Process and terminology. In general, weaving involves using a loom to interlace two sets of threads at right angles to each other. The warp, which runs longitudinally, and the weft that crosses it. One warp thread is called an end and one weft thread is called a pick. The warp threads are held taut and in parallel to each other, typically in a loom. There are many types of looms. Weaving can be summarized as a repetition of these three actions, also called the primary motion of the loom. Shedding, where the ends are separated by raising or lowering heeled frames to form a clear space where the pick can pass. Picking, where the weft or pick is propelled across the loom by hand, an airjet, a rapier or a shuttle. Beating up or battening, where the weft is pushed up against the fell of the cloth by the reed. The warp is divided into two overlapping groups, or lines that run in two planes, one above another, so the shuttle can be passed between them in a straight motion. Then, the upper group is lowered by the loom mechanism, and the lower group is raised, allowing to pass the shuttle in the opposite direction, also in a straight motion. Repeating these actions form a fabric mesh but without beating up. The final distance between the adjacent wefts would be irregular and far too large. The secondary motion of the loom, the let-off motion, where the warp is let off the warp beam at a regulated speed to make the filling even and of the required design. Take-up motion takes up the woven fabric in a regulated manner, so that the density of filling is maintained. The tertiary motions of the loom are the stop motions, to stop the loom in the event of a thread break. The two main stop motions are the warp stop motion, weft stop motion. The principal parts of a loom are the frame, the warp beam or weaver's beam, the cloth roll, the heddles, and the mounting, the reed. The warp beam is a wooden or metal cylinder on the back of the loom on which the warp is delivered. The threads of the warp extend in parallel order from the warp beam to the front of the loom where they are attached to the cloth roll. Each thread or group of threads of the warp passes through an opening in a heddle. The warp threads are separated by the heddles into two or more groups, each controlled and automatically drawn up and down by the motion of the heddles. In the case of small patterns, the movement of the heddles is controlled by cams, which move up the heddles by means of a frame called a harness. In larger patterns, the heddles are controlled by a dobby mechanism, where the heels are raised according to pegs inserted into a revolving drum. Where a complex design is required, the heels are raised by harness cords attached to a Jacquard machine. Every time the harness moves up or down, an opening is made between the threads of warp, through which the pick is inserted. Traditionally, the weft thread is inserted by a shuttle. On a conventional loom, the weft thread is carried on a pern, in a shuttle that passes through the shed. A hand-loom weaver could propel the shuttle by throwing it from side to side with the aid of a picking stick. The picking on a power loom is done by rapidly hitting the shuttle from each side using an overpick or underpick mechanism controlled by cams, 80 to 250 times a minute. When a pern is depleted, it is ejected from the shuttle and replaced with the next pern held in a battery attached to the loom. Multiple shuttle boxes allow more than one shuttle to be used. Each can carry a different color which allows banding across the loom. The rapier-type weaving machines do not have shuttles. They propel the weft by means of small grippers or rapiers that pick up the filling thread and carry it halfway across the loom, where another rapier picks it up and pulls it the rest of the way. Some carry the filling yarns across the loom at rates in excess of 2,000 meters per minute. Manufacturers such as Picanol have reduced the mechanical adjustments to a minimum, and control all the functions through a computer with a graphical user interface. Other types use compressed air to insert the pick. They are all fast, versatile and quiet. The warp is sized in a starch mixture for smoother running. The loom warped by passing the sized warp threads through 2 or more heddles attached to harnesses. The power weaver's loom is warped by separate workers. Most looms used for industrial purposes have a machine that ties new warps threads to the waist of previously used warps threads. While still on the loom, then an operator rolls the old and new threads back on the warp beam. The harnesses are controlled by cams, dobbies or a jacquard head. The raising and lowering sequence of warp threads in various sequences gives rise to many possible weave structures. Textile production went through profound changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. At the beginning of the century in America, weaving was still done by hand, both commercially and at home. Most professional weavers were men who did their work for sale. Women wove items at home for family use. By the end of the 19th century, weavers were simply mill workers who tended several water or steam-powered looms at a time. The increased speed of production brought more textiles to the average farmhouse and rendered plain weave, plain, and hop sacks, poplin, taffeta, polter soie, pibionese and grosgrain, twill weave. These are described by weft float followed by warp float, arranged to give diagonal pattern. 2/1 twill, 3/3 twill, 1/2 twill. These are softer fabrics than plain weaves. Satin weave, satins and satines. Complex computer-generated interlacings. Pile fabrics, such as velvets and velveteens. Both warp and weft can be visible in the final product. By spacing the warp more closely, it can completely cover the weft that binds it, giving a warp-faced textile such as rep weave. Conversely, if the warp is spread out, the weft can slide down and completely cover the warp, giving a weft-faced textile, such as a tapestry or a kilim rug. There are a variety of loom styles for hand weaving and tapestry. History. There are some indications that weaving was already known in the Paleolithic era. An indistinct textile impression has been found at the Dolna Vestinice site. The earliest known Neolithic textile production is supported by a 2013 find of a piece of cloth woven from hemp, in burial F. 7121 at the Catalhoyuk site, suggested to be from around 7000 BC. Further finds come from the advanced civilization preserved in the pile dwellings in Switzerland. Another extant fragment from the Neolithic was found in Fayum, at a site dated to about 5000 BCE. This fragment is woven at about 12 threads by 9 threads per centimeter in a plain weave. Flax was the predominant fiber in Egypt at this time and continued popularity in the Nile Valley, though wool became the primary fiber used in other cultures around 2000 BCE. Weaving was known in all the great civilizations, but no clear line of causality has been established. Early looms required 2 people to create the shed, and 1 person to pass through the filling. Early looms wove a fixed length of cloth, but later ones allowed warp to be wound out as the fill progressed. The weavers were often children or slaves. Weaving became simpler when the warp was sized. China and East Asia. The weaving of silk from silkworm cocoons has been known in China since about 3500 BCE. Silk that was intricately woven and dyed, showing a well-developed craft, has been found in a Chinese tomb dating back to 2700 BCE. Sericulture and silk weaving spread to Korea by 200 BCE, to Khotan by 50 CE, and to Japan by about 300 CE. The pit-treadle loom may have originated in India, though most authorities establish the invention in China. Pedals were added to operate heddles. By the Middle Ages, such devices also appeared in Persia, Sudan, Egypt, and possibly the Arabian Peninsula, where the operator sat with his feet in a pit below a fairly low-slung loom. In 700 AD, horizontal looms and vertical looms could be found in many parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe. In Africa, the rich dressed in cotton while the poorer wore wool. By the 12th century it had come to Europe either from the Byzantium or Moorish Spain, where the mechanism was raised higher above the ground on a more substantial frame. Medieval Europe, the predominant fiber was wool, followed by linen and nettle cloth for the lower classes. Cotton was introduced to Sicily and Spain in the 9th century. When Sicily was captured by the Normans, they took the technology to northern Italy and then the rest of Europe. Silk fabric production was reintroduced towards the end of this period, and the more sophisticated silk weaving techniques were applied to the other staples. The weaver worked at home and marketed his cloth at fairs. Warp-weighted looms were commonplace in Europe before the introduction of horizontal looms in the 10th and 11th centuries. Weaving became an urban craft, and to regulate the trade, craftsmen applied to establish a guild. These initially were merchant guilds, but developed into separate trade guilds for each skill. The cloth merchant, who was a member of a city's weavers' guild, was allowed to sell cloth. He acted as a middleman between the tradesmen weavers and the purchaser. The trade guilds controlled quality and the training needed before an artisan could call himself a weaver. By the 13th century, an organizational change took place, and a system of putting out was introduced. The cloth merchant purchased the wool and provided it to the weaver, who sold his produce back to the merchant. The merchant controlled the rates of pay and economically dominated the cloth industry. The merchant's prosperity is reflected in the wool towns of eastern England, Norwich, Bury St Edmunds and Lavenham being good examples. Wool was a political issue. The supply of thread has always limited the output of a weaver. About that time, the spindle method of spinning was replaced by the great wheel, and soon after the treadle-driven spinning wheel. The loom remained the same, but with the increased volume of thread it could be operated continuously. The 14th century saw considerable flux in population. The 13th century had been a period of relative peace. Europe became overpopulated. Poor weather led to a series of poor harvests and starvation. There was great loss of life in the 100 Years' War. Then in 1346, Europe was struck with the Black Death and the population was reduced by up to a half. Arable land was labor-intensive, insufficient workers no longer could be found. Land prices dropped, and land was sold and put to sheep pasture. Traders from Florence and Bruges bought the wool. Then sheep-owning landlords started to weave wool outside the jurisdiction of the city and trade guilds. The weavers started by working in their own homes, then production was moved into purpose-built buildings. The working hours and the amount of work were regulated. The putting-out system had been replaced by a factory system. Huguenot weavers, Calvinists, fleeing from religious persecution, migrated from mainland Europe to Britain around the time of 1685. They came from Flanders and the great silk-weaving cities of France, such as Lyon and Tours. They settled first in Canterbury, then some 13,050 moved to Spitalfields in London. Others moved further, to the silk-weaving town of Macclesfield. Their arrival challenged the English weavers of cotton, woolen and worsted cloth, who consequently learned the Huguenots' superior techniques. Weaving in the American colonies. Colonial America relied heavily on Great Britain for manufactured goods of all kinds. British policy was to encourage the production of raw materials in colonies and discourage manufacturing. The Wool Act 1699 restricted the export of colonial wool. As a result, many people wove cloth from locally produced fibers. The colonists also used wool, cotton and flax for weaving, though hemp could be made into serviceable canvas and heavy cloth. They could get one cotton crop each year. Until the invention of the cotton gin, it was a labor-intensive process to separate the seeds from the fibers. A plain weave was preferred as the added skill and time required to make more complex weaves kept them from common use. Sometimes designs were woven into the fabric, but most were added after weaving using woodblock prints or embroidery. Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, weaving was a manual craft and wool was the principal staple. In the Great Wool Districts, a form of factory system had been introduced, but in the uplands weavers worked from home on a putting-out system. The wooden looms of that time might be broad or narrow. Broad looms were those too wide for the weaver to pass the shuttle through the shed, so that the weaver needed an expensive assistant. This ceased to be necessary after John Kay invented the flying shuttle in 1733. The shuttle and the picking stick sped up the process of weaving. There was thus a shortage of thread or a surplus of weaving capacity. The opening of the Bridgewater Canal in June 1761 allowed cotton to be brought into Manchester, an area rich in fast-flowing streams that could be used to power machinery. Spinning was the first to be mechanized, and this led to limitless thread for the weaver. Edmund Cartwright was the first to attempt to mechanize weaving from 1785. He built a factory at Doncaster and obtained a series of patents between 1785 and 1792. In 1788, his brother Major John Cartwright built Revolution Mill at Retford. In 1791, he licensed his loom to the Grimshaw brothers of Manchester, but their knot mill burnt down the following year. Edmund Cartwright was granted a reward of £10,000 by Parliament for his efforts in 1809. However, success in power weaving also required improvements by others, including H. Horrocks of Stockport. Only during the 2 decades after about 1805 did power weaving take hold. At that time there were 250,000 hand weavers in the UK. Textile manufacture was one of the leading sectors in the British Industrial Revolution, but weaving was a comparatively late sector to be mechanised. The loom became semi-automatic in 1842 with Kenworthy and Bullock's Lancashire loom. The various innovations took weaving from a home-based artisan activity to steam-driven factories process. A large metal manufacturing industry grew to produce the looms. Firms such as Howard and Barlow of Accrington, and Tweedales and Smalley and Platt Brothers. Most power weaving took place in weaving sheds, in small towns circling Greater Manchester away from the cotton spinning area. The earlier combination mills where spinning and weaving took place in adjacent buildings became rarer. Wool and worsted weaving took place in West Yorkshire, in particular Bradford. Here there were large factories such as Lister's or Drummond's, where all the processes took place. Both men and women with weaving skills emigrated, and took the knowledge to their new homes in New England, to places like Pawtucket and Lowell. Woven, grey cloth, was then sent to the finishers where it was bleached, dyed and printed. Natural dyes were originally used, with synthetic dyes coming in the second half of the 19th century. The need for these chemicals was an important factor in the development of the chemical industry. The invention in France of the Jacquard Loom in about 1803 enabled complicated patterned cloths to be woven. By using punched cards to determine which threads of colored yarn should appear on the upper side of the cloth, the Jacquard allowed individual control of each warp thread, row by row, without repeating, so very complex patterns were suddenly feasible. Samples exist showing calligraphy, and woven copies of engravings. Jacquards could be attached to hand looms or power looms.